Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Richard and Pia, for the kind invitation for me to be here and to speak with you. It's really, truly wonderful to see real live people and to be here to interact with old friends and to make new friends. So what I'm going to do today is just give you an overview of what's happening at the National Institutes of Health with regard to research on ME/CFS as well as long COVID. So the National Institutes of Health is one agency of 11, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. They invest $45 billion per year. This is funding from 2021, so it's been a bit more than that now in 2023. But all of it is appropriated by Congress and from taxpayer dollars. So 84% of the funds are used to support more than 50,000 grants to 300,000 researchers at more than 2,500 universities, medical schools, and other research institutions in every state in the United States. And we call this extramural research, or research that's funded outside of NIH. And we also fund research in foreign countries. So especially we have a very large program now in global health, a lot of research dollars going to Africa actually and other low and middle income countries. We, let me go back. So we also support 10% of the, 10% of the funding goes to research that actually happens at the National Institutes of Health, what we call intramural research, and you'll hear from Dr. Avi Nath after me, who is leading our clinical division in NINDS, but he's just one of thousands of researchers who are actually supported by and do research at the institutes, at the NIH, in Bethesda and at other locations in the United States. So at NIH and across the agencies, we really strive to work together. So at NIH, we have the Trans-NIH ME/CFS working group that my director, the director of my institute, Dr. Walter Koroshetz, leads, and I assist him in coordinating that. And really it's to work across the institutes to see how can we accelerate and advance and support research on ME/CFS. So we hold quarterly briefings that are held by Zoom, and if you go to the website that's listed here, you can sign up for email alerts that will alert you to those quarterly telebriefings. We try to have a scientific speaker and then updates on what's happening at NIH. We support and assist investigators in the grant application process. And this is something that we realized was not happening when we took over the Trans-NIH ME/CFS working group in 2015. Researchers were contacting NIH and there was very little help and support for them to understand the research process to help them with their applications. And so we spend a lot of time talking, and this is what our role is to really help people through the process. We also provide oversight to the ME/CFS Collaborative Research Centers and the Data Management Coordinating Center, and I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. We also have the interagency ME/CFS, this keeps changing on its own, sorry, interagency ME/CFS working group that really fosters communication and collaboration across all the agencies, and this is coordinated by the NIH and the CDC, so I work very closely with my colleague Beth Unger and our supervisors, Dr. Koroshetz and her boss as well, to really coordinate this activity and mostly communication across the agencies so that we can help each other and understand what's going on across government agencies. So this is a graph that shows you the NIH funding for ME/CFS research, and you can see that it was pretty flat at about $5 million up until about 2015. In 2016, it started to really begin to ramp up and jumped up to $15 million when we funded 3 research centers and the Data Management Coordinating Center in 2017, and has stayed pretty steady since then. The dip in 2022 is simply because we didn't refund the 3 centers in 2022, and I'll come back to that as well. But I fully expect this to jump back up to almost $20 million in 2023 funding, or in 2024. So as I said, the intramural research at NIH is led primarily by Dr. Nath, and it now includes these 3 studies: the MECFS deep phenotyping study, which is complete, which you'll hear about from Dr. Nath, as well as a long COVID deep phenotyping study. And they're now also collaborating with the VA, the Veterans Administration, to do a deep phenotyping study for Gulf War veterans, where it's very interesting because these individuals had multiple vaccines before they were deployed to the Gulf, but then had multiple exposures to toxins while they were there, and many of them have very overlapping symptoms to MECFS. So this is a very interesting study that's going on at NIH as well. So NIH support for MECFS research, like I said, we're currently funding, we just renewed the center funding for Cornell University and the Data Management Coordinating Center. And our intent is to fund 2 additional centers. We also, most of the MECFS research, though, besides the centers and the Data Coordinating Center, are funded by what we call investigator-initiated studies. So grants come into NIH are reviewed and funded based on their scientific merit in review. So we fund, the majority of the funding goes to these kinds of grant applications that come in either to these specific funding calls for MECFS or any of the funding announcements that are open to all investigators. So you'll hear from Maureen Hansen later, but we have just, as I said, refunded for another 5 years, the Cornell MECFS Collaborative Research Center. And I won't go into the details, I'm sure Maureen will talk about that, but it's a really fantastic group of investigators really looking at underlying mechanisms of MECFS and using lots of different omics and different research approaches to do that. The Data Coordinating Management Center has developed, in the first 5 years of their funding, developed several collaborative research and communication tools. So they have a network website, and the links are here for you to take a look at. So the network website provides updates on what's happening in the research and other updates in the MECFS research community. Search MECFS is a tool where investigators can go to identify biospecimens that are available for their research. Right now, the biospecimens that are there are from a study that was funded by the Hutchins Foundation, the CFI initiative, but we're soon to be adding all of the biorepository that's at the CDC from a very large multi-center study that they did, as well as some other cohorts. MAP MECFS is a data sharing platform, and it initially was set up utilizing published data that they could curate from scientific publications, but we now have a very large database of data that's been contributed by the 3 collaborative centers that were funded that currently is being held privately until it's published, but then all of that data will be made available to researchers from anywhere in the world who wants to access that data, as well as we'll be adding in all of the data from the Intramural research study on MECFS. So MECFS, I put this together a couple of years ago from while I was sitting there at one of our investigator meetings, and you can see that MECFS research is really spanning a very large area of research in the United States in what we're funding. And just a couple of things that I think in the things that are in yellow that have been really brought home to me in terms of the heterogeneity of the disease, but the critical importance of the investigators to really take what we call sex as a biological variable. We're seeing now that there are really significant differences in the way MECFS it impacts individuals if you're a male or female. And so lumping everything together, male, female, really dilutes the data. And I mean, it's kind of an obvious thing, right? But I think that for researchers really have to pay attention to that and really separate the data, as well as length of illness. So it's really come from some of the data that's coming from the Jackson Labs Collaborative Center. showing that there are significant differences in individuals in metabolomes, the proteome, all the omics. If you look at individuals that have been ill 3 years or 4 years or less, or people that have been ill for 10 years or more. And this is especially true in the microbiome, where it seems that there's very early changes, but once someone's been ill for 10 years or more, the microbiome seems to come back to a more normal, not necessarily normal, but more normal level. And so it's really critically important to pay attention to that. So these are just some of the active ME/CFS researchers now who we're funding. It's exciting. We have a clinical fellow at Columbia University that we're funding who's looking at the epidemiology and determinants of neurological post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 and using an ME/CFS comparator group in his study. And I think the thing to notice here, again, is it's all over the map, really, looking at proteome, neuroimaging, endogenous retroviruses. The other thing to note here, which we've really been working hard, is to bring new researchers into the field. And almost all of the names here are new individuals who've come to ME/CFS within the last few years. In addition, those were more of our 2-year smaller grants meant to provide seed funding for individuals to get preliminary data to come in then with the larger grants. This is a list of the individuals we're funding now with 5-year grants. So you see here, again, it's all over the map from molecular and single cell immunology with a grant to Ron Davis, all the way to neuroinflammation and neuroimaging, a grant to Jared Younger, who's at the University of Alabama. So as Simon mentioned, we're in the process of developing an ME/CFS research roadmap. And really the goal here is to identify what do we know, what don't we know, or what do we think we know but we're not quite sure, and what do we need to find out to really move things toward clinical trials. So we had a previous group, a working group of our advisory council that provided a report in 2019 that was really more focused on infrastructure, but one of the recommendations there was that we develop a research strategic plan for ME/CFS research. Well, we had the plans ready to go, ready to launch in March of 2020 when the pandemic hit. And it just was not possible to move it forward with everyone focused on COVID. The clinicians were amazingly busy. The investigators were researchers were trying to figure out what to do with their labs closed. And so we finally now, coming out of the pandemic, have been able to launch this effort. So as I said, the charge is really to assess where are we at, what do we need to do to really accelerate the research to get to clinical trials. We have really not supported clinical trials, but we have funding and mechanisms at NIH to do that. So we're going to try to work toward understanding how we can really move that forward. And the way we're doing this is we have a working group that Simon and Richard are part of, Linda Tannenbaum and other leaders of the ME/CFS advocacy groups in the United States are part of that working group, together with other researchers and clinicians. We've also invited 21 individuals with lived experience to participate in this. It was an interesting process. We had a self-nomination process, and we were really overwhelmed. We got over 100 applications from people wanting to participate. From that, we selected 21 individuals who are working with us. And we've divided this into 7 working groups on these various topics. Each one of these working groups is working toward holding a webinar. And again, if you're signed up for our email list, you'll get notices of these webinars coming up to really focus high-level discussions on what is the state of the field in nervous system, for example, in ME/CFS. What are promising leads and what do we need to do to get to clinical trials? There will be opportunities along the way for public feedback through an online crowdsourcing tool that we're going to use. And then finally, all of this will come together to a report to NINDS Advisory Council. And once that takes place, then it will be our job at NIH and working together with the advocacy groups to really understand how do we mobilize and really put it into action. So it's not going to be a report that sits on a shelf, but it's really going to be a guide as to how we move and work together to move research forward. So I just wanted to announce that in this December, we're going to hold the second MECFS research conference that we've organized since taking over the working group. So this will be focused on advancing MECFS research, but also understanding what can we learn from what's happening in the research that's going on in long COVID. So it'll be held on the NIH campus, and the co-chairs of this meeting are Nancy Klimas, that's not right, Andrew Grimson, right? No, that is right, sorry. And Nancy Klimas from NOVA and Andrew Grimson from Cornell are the two co-chairs. And the organizing committee includes individuals with lived experience as well as other researchers and clinicians. In addition, we'll have a young investigator workshop on the day before that with travel awards. So we're hoping to bring over some of the European young investigators to mingle with our young investigators. So I think that will be a lot of fun. So I'm going to shift gears and very quickly give you an update on what's happening in what we call the RECOVER initiative. And this is, RECOVER stands for Researching COVID to Enhance Recovery. And as many of you know, the US Congress appropriated $1.15 billion for research on long COVID. They recognized the really significant need for research in this area because there are 98 million people who've had, and counting, right, who've had SARS-CoV-2 infection in the United States. 10 to 30% of them will experience long COVID or long-term symptoms. There are now over 200 researchers involved in the RECOVER initiative and 200 or more clinical research sites participating in this effort. So I just saw an update, but when I made my slides, these were the numbers. They recruited out of a goal of 15,000, more than 15,000 adults. They've recruited over 12,000 individuals to participate with the goal of almost 2,500 individuals who are pregnant. They've recruited over 1,800. And I saw now that the pediatric participants that they've recruited, that study is now completely recruited with more than 8,500 individuals. And you can find out more about these studies by going to this website. But in essence, what's happened, what's gone on so far in RECOVER is that they've set up many different sites where they're identifying and bringing these individuals in for serial visits over the course of 2 years to really collect biospecimens, clinical data, do clinical evaluations, to really understand and collect the data, and as I said, biospecimens for further studies, what's happening and to try to utilize these the data and biospecimens to understand the pathophysiology of long COVID. So it's primarily focused on individuals with less mild to moderate, not necessarily the individuals who are hospitalized with really severe cardiovascular and lung issues, but really the individuals who had COVID and now continue to be ill with long COVID. So they're also ramping up to do clinical trials, and they're going to do clinical trials in 5 focus areas. So viral persistence, really looking at where is the virus hiding out and what's going on in the immune system to really continue to infect and cause the symptoms that you see in long COVID. They're looking at autonomic dysfunction. So what happens to the individual to develop orthostatic intolerance, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, breathing, digestion, and other kinds of autonomic dysfunction that you see in long COVID. There's clinical trials that are developing to look at cognitive dysfunction. There's clinical trials to look at exercise intolerance and fatigue, as well as sleep disturbances. And you may or may not be aware that there's been significant controversy in the United States about the planned study to use graded exercise as a clinical trial for long COVID. And so the protocol for that is back under consideration because of the outcry from the patient population. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that clinical trial. My understanding is that what it was really focused on was exercise and rehab to strengthen heart and lung, but I think they really underestimated and didn't take into consideration what we know can be really harmful effects of exercise if not done appropriately and carefully in this patient population. So I know several of these clinical trials are just about ready to launch and will be enrolling in the United States quite soon. So with that, I will stop and take questions if anyone has any questions. Here's my email address. I'm happy to respond to anyone who has questions. You can contact me, and I will certainly get back to you. But again, thank you for your attention, and thank you for being here, and thank you again for the invitation to participate.
Thank you, Vicky. Any questions for Vicky? Please raise your hand and you'll get the speaker box. No questions?
If not, I'll be around all day, either between here or the Young Investigator Workshop, so just...
It's probably a good sign, Vicky, you don't get questions. You've covered everything.
Yeah.
Sorry, there is one.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. You mentioned the demographics, the numbers in the United States. Do you have estimates in the worldwide population? Those figures of...
for long COVID?
Yeah, long COVID.
I've seen them. I would have to look them up. I don't off the top of my head, but I can look that up and let you know what those are.
Question, Christian, one at the back. Maureen? No, sorry.
I wondered if in America there's better recognition now amongst, say, the primary care physicians of ME and its effects on patients. I mean, there's been a long history, obviously, in the UK of, I'm a retired GP, by the way, of GPs not understanding ME at all and dismissing it and causing a lot of distress. I think that's changed quite a bit, but...
So, no, that's an excellent question. My impression in talking to patients is that there's recognition now that ME/CFS is a real disease, and there's recognition, growing recognition of sort of this whole class of post-infectious or post-trigger disease where you have an acute onset that then carries on into a chronic disease. So there's, I think, much better recognition and acceptance. I would have to say that I don't think that our care has changed yet. I think that GPs and most clinicians still don't have a clue what to do when someone with ME/CFS shows up in their office, unfortunately. And that's, I think, there's a clinical consortium in the United States that came together to put together treatment diagnosis and treatment guidelines. And they will take consultations from clinicians across the country and really provide, I think, a really good guidance for individuals. And there's, I think, with the long COVID clinics, there's going to be many more individuals clinicians who understand the chronic nature of these diseases. And right now, as far as I'm aware, the long COVID clinics aren't accepting individuals with ME/CFS unless you have long COVID. But I think that those clinics will also be opening up to begin to accept individuals with ME/CFS.
Christian.
Just one question regarding the WHO definitions of long COVID. I'm just wondering what your US reflections or thoughts are on those pretty wishy-washy definitions of long COVID versus 1 year. So how are you thinking around that question?
So that's a good question, the definition of long COVID. There's actually, the National Academy of Sciences at the end of the month is holding a workshop to come to a definition of long COVID. Because actually, I think there's different definitions being used even between the federal agencies. So we say 3 to 4 months of illness following the acute onset of COVID, with continuing lingering symptoms, of which I am sure you know that there are so many different symptoms of long COVID. But I think what this National Academy of Science meeting will try to do is come to some better definition of what long COVID is, and some more definitive definition than what the WHO has put out.
We have a question up at the back there, I think.
Hi.
Hi.
Just a kind of an opinion question rather than a fact, but
Sure.
just with everything going on and all the research is approved and going on across the globe, how far in terms of time do you think we are away from a definitive test to show ME/CFS in someone?
A diagnostic test?
A diagnostic test, yeah.
I think we're getting quite close. I think that there, and you'll probably hear some of this from Maureen Hansen, I think that there are, and maybe as well as some of the other speakers, that there are really beginning to be some really definitive markers that differentiate individuals with ME/CFS from healthy controls. So I think that we're getting closer. I think my personal opinion is it's likely not to be one marker, one thing, because ME/CFS is so heterogeneous. So it may need to be a panel of markers that are carried out to diagnose ME/CFS. So I think we're getting very close to having some of that information to then move from having that to having it validated and put into clinical care is another story, right? You have to go through all the regulatory hoops to do that, and that can take years. But I think we're getting very close to having something that we could hang our hats on and say that this may be a panel of markers that we could use to diagnose ME/CFS.
Thank you.
Okay, so Vicky is around. Oh, we have another one more. Last question.
Yes.
But wait, the box is coming.
Thank you. So is there a plan after those markers are established and approvals to put her into clinical practice to accelerate the time that it takes for clinicians to adopt that practice? There's numbers out there that it takes between 17 to 20 years between those two steps. And I think that it's the wait has been long enough. Waiting for another 17 to 20 years for that to be implemented is certainly too long.
No, agreed. And I think that's where our cooperation and communication across the federal agencies is critical, because we've already begun those kinds of conversations with the FDA. What will it take once we get there? Also with our CMS, which is the agency that funds Medicare, Medicaid. And so what would it take to accelerate once we have a test? Well, and the same with any kind of drug that's available. What would it take to accelerate their approval to get it into clinical care, and so that they would pay for it in that population that's covered by Medicare, Medicaid in the United States. What we haven't approached yet are all the health insurance groups. But I think that you're right. It would be ludicrous to have something and then have to wait another 20 years before it gets put into clinical practice. So we're already beginning to think about what we would need to do to accelerate that. Thank you for the question. Okay, well, I'll be around all day, and I'm happy to talk with anyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky.